Are you serious? What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. My name is Tyler. Today we're going to be talking about the new MacBook Pros, not the 13-inch MacBook Pro that was announced last year, but instead the 14 and 16-inch follow-ups to the MacBook Pro, and these are a little different. So let's see what we're working with. So the biggest things with these new MacBooks right out of the gate is obviously the Apple's offering two new chips now. They have the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, both of which are going to be basically M1 level improvements over the original M1, if that makes any sense. Nearly 2 times or 4 times the performance of the M1. So if you remember how excited I got about the M1 chip last year, these are basically the M1 chips of M1. So the other big thing here with these new MacBooks is that they've returned to sort of a similar shape that most of us are probably used to from MacBooks from a few years ago. They've got more of that rectangular rounded off shape as opposed to like the tapered slim finish as you might see on like the MacBook Air or even the 13-inch MacBook Pro. They finally brought back the ports. The craziest thing to be excited about ports in 2021, but here we are. You can see now they have MagSafe 3, which is supposed to be super improved from the previous MagSafe. If you remember, MacBooks from a few years ago had that magnetic connector. They're bringing that back. It's a lot more powerful, delivers a lot more power, which is great. Thunderbolt 4/USB-C, as we have come to expect at this point, but you get 3 of them, which is great. Headphone jack still there for my audiophiles out there. You have an SDXC port, finally, for photographers, videographers, and you know, people alike, mostly photographers and videographers. Being able to have an SD slot on the MacBook is really, really nice. Not having to carry a dongle around is very convenient. And then full-size HDMI. I mean, we haven't seen one of those on a MacBook in quite some time. So nice to finally see that back. You never know when you need HDMI. Weirdly, you know, I find myself needing a full-size HDMI quite often, actually, especially because the HDMI standard is being improved, you know, time and time again. I think we're at like HDMI 2 now. So definitely nice to have that there. Let's see, keyboard. The most important thing to note here is that the function row keys at the very top are full size. They are getting a full-on shout out this time around for professional users who need those function keys. The touch bar, as you've noticed, is completely gone. None of the models offer touch bar options, so that is good. If you remember in my review, I neither hated it nor loved it per se. I fell somewhere in the middle. I think it's cool. I thought it had some potential to be useful, but generally speaking, I still don't really use it, even to this day, almost a year later. And I'm kind of glad that they just went ahead and said, you know what, get rid of it. I think for the pro level devices such as these, I think people are really, you know, looking for more manual control over their machine as opposed to having some weird contextual touchscreen button, fun emoji selecting touchscreen on the top of their keyboard. So sound is a big deal in this new one, supposedly. You have a 6-speaker sound system, 4 force canceling woofers, reveal notes up to half octave deeper, blah, blah, blah. So 80% more bass. That's pretty nice for a laptop. Remember, this is still a laptop, but Macs have notoriously always had really good sound quality. Even my 13-inch MacBook Pro is fantastic. The iPad Pro, which video coming soon, so make sure to get subscribed, has really loud and nice speakers for a mobile device. So that's great. And then spatial audio. This was a big thing that they talked about during the keynote quite a bit, this whole spatial audio thing. So I suppose that's pretty cool. I'm not a super audiophile myself, but with Dolby Atmos and that sort of thing, I think it's kind of nice to have the options there, I suppose, if sound is your thing. So that is there. Let's talk about they did update the webcam. So the webcam is finally 1080p, so thumbs up for that. It used to be 720p for the longest time and everyone complained about it, and then they tried to make an update where it was like a software like, oh, we're enhancing the 720p image and making it so much better. They're finally putting a 1080p camera in, so awesome. And you'll notice in this image here that there's a notch. There's a notch on the new MacBooks, which, why? You might ask. I don't see FaceTime written anywhere here. I don't remember FaceTime ever being mentioned during the keynote or during the presentation, so who knows? But there is a notch on the MacBook now. So just keep that in mind. I think by this point we're all pretty used to notches. However, I think the idea was to go away from notches. I mean, most modern smartphones nowadays don't have a notch and have found ways around it. Apple still doing their notches, and then for whatever reason on their most professional device add the notch back in. So we'll see kind of why that is. I don't think it'll take up too much screen real estate. I think it'll really just sit at the top where that status bar usually is in macOS anyway, so maybe it won't be that big of a deal. Speaking of the display, they brought the Liquid Retina XDR display to the MacBook finally. It's the same display technology that you'll find on the iPad Pro 12.9 inch. So it uses that same mini LED technology, and more exciting than that, well, maybe not more exciting, but super exciting, another exciting feature is they are bringing ProMotion now to the MacBooks, which again, similar to the now iPhone 13 Pro and the iPad Pro, finally bringing that ProMotion display technology to the MacBook, which is great, especially for people who are used to 120 plus hertz, or people who might try to play some games on this thing. We'll see. But generally speaking, having that extra 120 hertz is super nice. And from what I understand from the keynote, you can go back in and actually select a different refresh rate if you need that. So like 59 hertz, 60 hertz, etc. But it's nice to have it. So yeah, XDR, it's got the P3 color gamut. So obviously it's gonna be super color accurate, great for color work, Photoshop, Lightroom, all those different kinds of things. HDR content's gonna be fantastic. It's basically the same display in the iPad Pro 12.9 inch. So you have 1,000 nits sustained brightness, 1,600 peak brightness for HDR content, 10,000 mini LEDs, 1 million to 1 contrast ratio, and 1 billion colors. Super cool stuff there. And as you can see, the two sizes, like I mentioned, there's a 16.2 inch and a 14.2 inch, or a 14 and a 16, whatever you want to say. And resolution-wise, they're pretty similar. The 16 inch is going to be the closest to a full 4K display. You got 3456 by 2234, which is very close to 4K, or maybe it is 4K just because the aspect ratio is slightly adjusted. And then your 14 inch is a 3024 by 1964, which is still really good, especially on a 14 inch display. So I think that'll be just fine. Both have 254 pixels per inch. So the pixel density is going to be roughly the same, or is the same. You are getting about almost 2 million more pixels on the 16 inch, but you're also got 2 inches of display, so that makes sense. I don't think you'll see much resolution difference between the 14 and the 16. I really do think that it's just going to be a size thing, whether you want a smaller laptop or a slightly larger laptop. So there's that. Okay, Pro to the Max. So now we've got, like I mentioned in the beginning, we have two new M1 chips, the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. So what does that mean? Apple has here M1 Pro, scary fast, and M1 Max, scary faster. And that seems about right. So now on both chips, you have a 10-core CPU up from the 8-core CPU on the original M1. And then on the M1 Pro, you can have up to a 16-core GPU, which on the regular M1, you are only getting up to an 8-core GPU. And then on the M1 Max, you have options up to a 32-core GPU, which is quite impressive. On the M1 Pro, you can have up to 32 gigabytes of unified memory, which I believe on the original M1, you were getting 16 gigs of unified memory at the top. And then on the M1 Max, basically you just double everything. You have up to 64 gigabytes of unified memory, which is insane for a laptop. And then of course, on the M1 Pro, you have up to 200 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, and then again, doubling that on the M1 Max, 400 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. During the keynote or during the presentation, they talked about sort of how basically the M1 Pro and the M1 Max are basically the same, just the M1 Max is kind of like double that. It's got double the unified memory and that sort of thing. So basically, if you are doing insane amounts of 3D work or using your MacBook as sort of a desktop on steroids, or a laptop on steroids that's more like a desktop, that would basically determine whether you want a Pro or a Max. Basically, it's fast. I mean, there's really not much more to say. Both have a 16-core neural engine, just like the original M1, so nothing's really changed there. One important thing to note, though, is that the M1 Pro and the M1 Max both have ProRes accelerators. So if you shoot in ProRes, like I am right now, for that matter, having a ProRes accelerator dedicated hardware is super nice. It's going to make editing 4K, 6K, 8K video streams super, super smooth. And it was already very smooth on the original M1, so I can't imagine what it's going to be like. The M1 Pro has 1 ProRes accelerator, and the M1 Max has 2 ProRes accelerators. So as you can see here, up to 7 streams of 8K ProRes video playback. I don't know in what workflow you would ever need to be able to do that, but hey, why not? Support up to 4 external displays. From what I understand, you can power 3 of those Apple XDR displays through Thunderbolt 4, and then obviously with your HDMI port being able to support another display, maybe up to another 4K display, if you will, or maybe even something higher. We'll have to wait and see. Which is, again, insane. Like I was saying, you could literally take the MacBook Pro, use it like dock it or sit it in your corner of your desk, plug in 3, Apple Pro XDR displays, and I don't know, have 7 8K streams of video running at the same time, because why not? Off a laptop. A laptop, by the way, remember, this is a laptop, guys. A laptop. CPU performance, just a bunch of numbers here. You know how Apple is. They're not super specific on the numbers. They just kind of give you like a 3 times, 4 times, 10 times performance increase. All you need to really know is that it is f***ing fast. I mean, the M1 was fast, and the M1 crushed a lot of other systems. These are basically 2 to 3 times that. So like I said, this is basically the M1 of M1. So that's all you really need to know. GPU performance, same thing. Depending if you get the 16 or the 32 core GPU, you're getting 9 to 13 times more performance with, like, for example, Intel Iris built-in graphics. And even compared to the original M1, I mean, you're getting probably at least 2 times the performance on the M1 Pro, or maybe 4 times performance on the M1 Max is in comparison to the original M1 chip. And then they made a big deal about battery life. 14-inch model, they claim up to about 17 hours of video playback, 11 hours of wireless web browsing, which is really good, just like the original M1 MacBook. Great battery life, and still maintaining a ton of that performance, which, by the way, unlike most laptops, the M1 systems all perform the same whether they're plugged in or on battery, so that's really important to note. They did make a big deal about that during the keynote as well, about how, discrete GPU gaming laptops have a huge power drop off when they're not plugged in or when they're on battery versus when they're plugged in, so on and so forth. And then on your 16-inch model, 21 hours of video playback and 14 hours of wireless web browsing. It's got some fans, obviously. I don't think that's super important. If it's anything like the original M1 MacBook, the fans barely ever come on. I don't expect the fans to come on this system much either, and if they do, probably going to be whisper quiet, so not a big deal. The storage speeds are insane, with configuration up to 8 terabytes of solid state storage, 7.4 gigabytes a second, which is 2 times the previous generation. So open 8K videos, and I mean, this is literally a machine for people who are filming in 6 or 8K, which is not me, unfortunately. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of the new MacBook Pros in a nutshell. Like I said, price-wise, they're starting at $2,000 for the 14-inch. We can go actually over to order. Let's see the options here. So you have your 14-inch. Here's the two pre-configured models. First one starting at $2,000 with the 8-core CPU and a 14-core GPU. So that is important to note. You can get the M1 Pro with an 8-core CPU and 14-core GPU. That is kind of like the lowest spec, if you will, which is going to be closer to that original M1. They do start at 16 gigs of memory instead of 8, so that's great. 512 gigs of storage as opposed to 256, and yeah, you still get all the same ports and all that stuff. Now, one thing to note, that you do get different power adapters depending on what model you decide to go for. So with the cheapest model, you only get a 67 watt power adapter, whereas even just on the bumped up version, you get a 96 watt. And I think on the 16-inch, I think it goes up even higher than that to a 140 watt power adapter for all 3 16-inch models. So keep that in mind. That's going to affect how fast your laptop charges. And then for the slightly upgraded 14-inch, you get kind of that standard M1 Pro configuration, which is going to be the 10-core CPU, 16-core GPU, still 16 gigs of memory, a 1 terabyte storage option, and that's going to be for $2,500, about a $500 difference there. So those are your two pre-configured options for the 14-inch. Now we can go in, which Personally, I would recommend a 14-inch. I think a 16-inch nowadays is just such a big laptop, and especially with a laptop like this where you're gonna likely be plugging it into an external display, given how powerful it is. I think a 14 is the most, 13 or 14 is like right in that sweet spot for me personally, where, you know, it's still portable, but also still big enough where it's worth using it over, say, you know, an iPhone or something like that. So with your 14-inch max spec here, you can spec the 14-inch with an M1 Max chip if you choose either the 24-core GPU version or the 32-core GPU version. You can get up to the 64 gigs of memory at that point, and then up to 8 terabytes of storage. So you can basically configure the 14-inch MacBook Pro very similarly to the 16-inch if you choose, which is nice to see. They're not forcing you to jump up to that 16-inch to get anything. Like with the iPad Pro, for example, the 11-inch iPad Pro doesn't have that XDR display. So if you want the XDR display, then you got to bump up to the 12.9-inch. So I'm glad that they weren't doing that here. And then, so that's going to run you about $5,900, which is literally insane. But hey, for what it can do, maybe it's worth it. So let's go back here. Let's look at the 16-inch. So you have 3 pre-configurated options for the 16-inch, all of which have 10-core CPUs. 2 of them have the 16-core GPU, and then the top spec one has 32-core GPU. All of them have 16 gigs of memory, except for the final one, which starts at 32, but obviously, like we said, can go up to 64. And then pretty much standard, same storage options. 16-inch is going to start at 25, which is pretty solid, but like we saw before, for 2,500 on the 14-inch, you can get a pretty good setup as well. So yeah, so you're still getting the M1 Pro for 2,500, but on the 16-inch, still getting the Pro. So at that point, you're really just paying for the extra screen real estate and the extra resolution, if that's something you're into. But let's go to a 16-inch and let's max config to see where we're at. 64 gigs, 8 terabytes, which adds $2,000, by the way, $2,200 to add the 8 terabyte storage option. That's going to run you about $6,000, $6,100 actually, but that's going to be a fully loaded 16-inch MacBook Pro. So yeah, that is basically the MacBook Pros in a nutshell. They are shipping as early as, I guess, in the next couple weeks here. It looks like order today delivers around November 18th, middle of November. So we'll have to wait and see kind of what the numbers look like, and maybe we get our hands on one, maybe we don't. I don't know yet. I'm still super happy with my original M1 MacBook Pro. These are definitely a whole other level. I mean, I could practically replace my custom desktop with one of these things. If I were to go for one personally, it would be the $2,500 one. And honestly, I'd probably be okay with the $2,000 one if I didn't already have the original M1 MacBook Pro. So take that with what you will. Like I said, if you already have an iPad Pro or you already have a custom desktop that you do most of your projects and most of your work on, and you just need that extra powerhouse on the go, I think a base 14-inch is going to be your best option. I don't really see a reason of going to the 16 and maxing it out at all. And like I said, unless it is purely your only system to work on, in which case, then maybe it makes sense. Like if you're not going to plug in 2 to 3 external 5K, 6K, 8K displays to this thing, I just don't see the worth of going to the 16. I think it becomes, at that point, a 16-inch laptop is dangerously close to a 17-inch laptop, which if you've ever had a 17-inch laptop like I have, they're a bit of a pain in the ass to lug around. Most travel backpacks don't fit a 17-inch laptop anymore. Most of them are built for 15-inch laptops. So yeah, I think a 14-inch is going to be like the sweet spot. But yeah, that's the new MacBook Pros. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out. I'm going to drink my Monster now. Product placement, Monster. I'm here.